Thank you so much for being here. So we're here to talk about analyzing pre-assessment data and then planning some next steps with that. So to introduce these speakers, my name is Brendan Finch. I taught middle and high school science in Los Angeles for 7 years at LUSD and a couple of charter networks. I left the classroom to build RocketLit.com. This is our sister site, has adaptive science reading for middle school kiddos, and then started building Inner Orbit about 5 years ago. We started working on that. I wrote a lot of the assessments. Initially, we wrote a lot of performance task style assessments, so like three-dimensional questions. And we've realized over the course of all that time that there are lots of ways that we can ask smaller questions to scaffold up to that. So some of what we'll talk about today is how, we think about those questions and then how folks are leveraging those questions for pre-assessments. And that's the focus of today's conversation. I also just wanted to share unprompted that I think pepperoni and jalapeno and pineapple pizza it's a gift. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to my wonderful colleague, Erin.
Hey, everyone. So nice to meet you. I'm Erin Cook. My pronouns are she, her. My background is in upper elementary teaching, coaching, and special ed. With Inner Orbit, I am our director of implementation. So I get to help a lot of awesome people design assessments to meet their needs in their classroom. And we're just a bunch of unprompted folks today sharing some information. I have broke the mold, everyone. I am a cat and a dog person. You could be both. Don't make them choose one. So I have both cats and dogs, and both are equal and lovely. Awesome. Well, back to you, Brendan.
All right, let's dive in. I want to ask more questions about the whole cat and dog thing, but we're here to talk about questions that are pre-assessments and data that you can get from that. So our objective for today is to explore how science educators and folks that support those educators can leverage pre-assessments on Inner Orbit to make data-informed decisions. Obviously, you could apply this learning to any platform that you're using to collect that data, but we are building Inner Orbit, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Our agenda for today is we're going to talk about what Inner Orbit is. We have this phenomenon, these questions, and we've also grouped these things into assessments. That's kind of a newer thing. So we want to make sure to walk you through that. And then we also do a lot of professional learning. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then Erin is going to dive into a use case. So we have a partner that we're going to go over who did some elementary and middle school pre-assessments. And Erin's going to talk a little bit about their needs and the content they use for their assessment outlook and the design. And then we're going to dive into some data analysis of that data from that assessment, those assessments. And it's going to be fun. So Erin and I will do kind of like an I do, and then you should feel free to type stuff in the chat, but then we're going to pass it off completely to y'all to dive into the data on your own. And then we're going to talk about what should we do next. So I think a lot of the work that we do with folks is just kind of getting started and like just doing something. And now we want to think about how we're refining and honing our instructional decisions, our professional learning, or any decisions that we're making, figure out what we should do next. We're going to look at that. Erin is going to walk us through that through the lens of MTSS, through professional learning, and then through scaffolding review as different ways for us to apply the data to other decisions. And smell that, Erin? It smells like potential. Yeah, that's right. I did it. Okay, so real quick, I just want to dive into what Inner Orbit is to kind of give you some background. This is intended, if you use Inner Orbit, you're going to be super familiar with this. If you don't use Inner Orbit yet, we want to explain to you our philosophy so that the rest of this presentation makes more sense. So first thing, we aggregate all of these phenomena. So we're looking to give students an opportunity to take what they're learning in their classroom and apply it to a novel thing. That is what a phenomena is. They're natural events that can be explained with science knowledge. And so students should learn about something through the course of a unit, and they'll be able to apply that learning to something else to show that they deeply understand it. That process is called sense making. And so to think about those phenomena, to build those phenomena, we like to write a scaffolded series of questions, and those are all based around a performance expectation. So this session is going to go a little bit differently than other ones. If you've been at other webinars, this is new. If you haven't been to them, then this is what it is. So we're going to look at a specific standard, NGSS 1.2, and we're going to dive into how we might write questions for this standard. So this standard asks students to develop and use a model to describe the role of gravity in the motions within galaxies and the solar system. This is a three-dimensional standard, as are all of the NGSS standards. Some don't have a cross-cutting concept. I don't know if you knew that. Anyways, so there are SEPs. The science extension practice here is developing using models. Students have to develop and use models to describe phenomena. There are two DCI elements. One is on Earth and its solar system being part of the Milky Way, and then the other are looking at like what are parts of our solar system. So that's kind of two different pieces to this. The cross-cutting concept, which is the third dimension of the standard, is system and system models, and that we can use models to represent systems and their interactions. And so looking at parts of a system and how those interact with the rest of the system is what we're looking to do. And so one of the phenomena that we have on the site is, why does Saturn have so many moons? So what we want to think about is how we can take that standard and apply that towards something very, very specific. So again, students aren't just looking at like water or like there's gravity. Why does Saturn have so many moons? Like, what is it with that system that involves gravity and the different parts of our solar system and their interactions? Okay, so we give students this context around why does Saturn have so many moons. And then we want to start to ask questions to parse apart. So how are students performing relative to that three-dimensional standard? And we do that through a series of questions. The first type of, and so you can go on the website right now and you can find, there are 17 questions, I think, in that cluster of why does Saturn have so many moons. And I'm going to walk you through the different types of questions within those 17 in there, but you can go through the website and pick questions to build an assessment. So you don't have to find those phenomena. You don't have to write those questions. Okay, first question type we call prior knowledge questions. And we like to think about this through the lens of what would students have had to learn prior to show readiness for the on-grade level content. So these questions for this middle school standard will go back to a 5th grade element. We ask students, which of the following is an observation that serves as evidence that the moon orbits around the Earth? We want them to identify that there are phases of the moon. That's a part of the 5th grade standard, looking at interactions of the phases of the moon and what evidence we can see that shows that, there is the Earth, Sun, Moon system, and that the Earth goes around the sun and the moon goes around the Earth. Okay, cool. So we like to think about this in this flow from knowledge to two-dimensional understanding to three-dimensional understanding. And this question is very, very specifically only targeting whether students have knowledge. So we are not ticking the cross-cutting concepts or SCP boxes here. We're just looking at, do you have the content knowledge that you need to move on? And the next type of question that we write on our site are called on grade level knowledge questions. So these questions are one-dimensional, just asking about what students know. Do you understand what gravity does? Why does gravity keep things in orbit in the solar system? So now we're asking if students have the knowledge they need in order to start applying that to the more advanced concepts that we're going to look at later on in this. And so here we're only leveraging the DCI, but it's at the grade level. So we asked a prior knowledge question. Now we're on grade level knowledge question. And now we're going to go up through our grade level scaffold. So at the grade level at middle school, how can we ask questions that progressively become more complex and then will yield data that is useful to us? And that's what this webinar is all about. So the next type of question that we write, or another type of question, will be questions focusing on the content and practices. This is a DCI and an SEP question. And here we're asking students to look at which model represents the relationship between our sun and the Milky Way galaxy. Students have to compare different model types to figure out how that system fits within the larger system of the Milky Way. This question does not involve the cross-cutting concept. It is just looking at developing these models and their understanding of that system right there and how that is held together with gravity. So if we ask that question, then we can get some data on students' understanding of models as a representation of parts of the system. And then we can also ask questions about the cross-cutting concept. So this question asks, any model of our solar system would need to show that the blank of planets determine the gravitational interaction they have with other objects in space. So what determines the gravitational interaction and how could we model that? So what are the components of that model and how do those things act together? So this does not ask about the actual visual model. It's asking about the components of that model, which is why it's hitting that system and system models, not developing using models. And that is, that's our two-dimensional question on the cross-cutting concept of the DCI, to get an idea of whether students can apply their understanding of components of a model rather than that visual representation of a model, which is what the SCP question is. And these are tricky questions because it is difficult to try to write questions on developing using models and system models. So this is an example of how we articulate that. So if you're wondering like, hey, I think these all have to be wrapped up together, the answer is I don't think so. You can ask questions about the parts of a model, then ask questions about visual representations as two different ways to figure out whether students are struggling with the cross-cutting concept or the SCP. All right, I digress. And then we'll ask questions that we call three-dimensional. So this will look at the cross-cutting concept, the DCI, and the SCP all together. Use the data and the model that we give in Figure 1 to explain why Saturn has so many moons, then explain why it would be difficult for a planet like Mercury to have any moons. And so in this way, we're able to see, okay, so you can make sense of the Saturn phenomena and now explain why Mercury won't be able to have, like however many moons. I think it depends on your definition of moon, but Saturn has quite a lot of them. Mercury does not have nearly as many. So this is a three-dimensional question. Students use that understanding of the parts of a model. They need to understand how gravity plays into that interaction, and they have to cite evidence from the models that we give them in order to make sense of this phenomenon. These are three-dimensional questions. It's a free response question, but we also have multiple choice questions that are three-dimensional. Okay, cool. So if you're not familiar with inner orbit, that's a breakdown of how we write our questions to kind of scaffold up. And then there's a lot of data that comes out of that as well. But in case you don't want to go on the site and like pick questions and choose them, some people like to go to the market and just buy like a big bundle of apples, and some people like to pick them out individually. I'm more of an apple bag kind of guy. And so we have these things called pre-made assessments that we've also built to help you scaffold up, in measuring how students are doing. First type of pre-made assessment they have are called scaffolded formative assessments. If you're assessing a single standard on inner orbit, you can find these scaffolded formative assessments on the site. There are 4 to 5 questions, and they involve this scaffold. So we'll ask questions about the knowledge only, so one-dimensional DCI only questions, some two-dimensional questions, and then some hitting the SEP or the cross-cutting concept, and then some three-dimensional questions, going all the way up the scaffold. And in addition, let's say you've given the formative assessment. Now you want to see how students are applying that knowledge to another phenomena. We have these things called sense-making summatives, which are groups of questions for a single standard. These are usually 4 questions. I think some of them may have 5. It depends on how complex the standard is and what we think is ample evidence of sense-making. So these will ask only two-dimensional questions, hitting the DCI and SCP or that cross-cutting concept, and then three-dimensional questions. So the formative has a full scaffold. The summative has just the end of the scaffold, so the top portion of that. And these are 2 ways you can go on the site. You can search for a standard and then pull one of these assessments and just use it. Really, really easy. Or you can use our inventories. And so these are all standards in a grade level or a subject. So all of high school life science standards, all of middle school earth science standards, like everything. And so these range from 20 to 40 questions. Some of these are enormous things. They only have 2 and 3D questions. And so a couple of the ways that we find people using these are like a thorough baseline or as an end of the year snapshot before a standardized test. So if you're going to like give questions, let's say I'm a 6th grade earth science teacher and I want to ask all the questions from elementary school earth science, I can go into these inventories and pick out all of the 2 and 3D questions from elementary school or from 5th grade. Or if I'm, a bio teacher in high school and I want to assess what life science knowledge students have from middle school, I can go in and ask and pull in this entire inventory of all middle school life science questions and get an idea of like where students are at with all these complex things. Okay, so all of those questions, all of those pre-med assessments then feed into our reports. And so what we're looking to do is not make claims about students like did okay in developing some models. That's what a state test will tell you. And we're looking to be more specific and actionable than that. But instead to say students did really well developing a model using an analogy, example, or abstract representation. But students struggled to develop a model to describe unobservable mechanisms. That's a very, very specific thing. Great question. The last thing we do is that we build professional learning experiences. Primarily, Aaron builds these professional learning experiences. So if you would like to chat with us and get a little bit of help with implementing the NGSS in your context, then reach out to us anytime. All right, so that is the long introduction to our session. And now it's story time. And Mrs. Cook is going to walk us through the pre-assessment story for this partner district that used this kind of like big pre-assessment to make to get some data about how students are coming in. Erin, tell us more about this story.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brendan, for setting the stage for us. So now when we're diving into this story, you can really see the context of what types of assessments did this context have access to, why did they make the decisions they made. You can see a little bit more of the tools that they had in front of them and how they picked what they picked. So here we go, some story time here. So I first want to set the context about this amazing partner of ours in Kentucky. So they're about a medium-sized suburban school district in the state of Kentucky, which has been a fully NGSS state for a long time and has very long history with their state science assessment being three-dimensional. And what this district was aiming to accomplish is they felt the need at the tested grade levels in Kentucky, it's 4th and 7th grade, and they were really looking for ways to support those science teachers at those tested grades. Those teachers were really feeling the crunch that they were the grade level that was being responsible for a whole bunch of standards being assessed rather than like an ELA or math assessment that happens every year. As you all know, with those grade band assessments, those teachers where it lands on, they have just an extra lens looking at those state assessments. So they were ultimately trying to find a KSA or a Kentucky Science Assessment preparation resource for their teachers at those grade levels. And something about their district as well is they were already into this common assessment practice. We already had resources for teachers for state tests in reading and math, but not for science. So they were, saying that this is still an assessed subject, even though it's assessed less often. So we need to find some resources for this. An additional piece I want to add to this context is science classes at the elementary level, because we're going to start there first in our story today, are only 40 minutes. And if there are any elementary science teachers out there, that really only means like 20 minutes of actual instruction as you're getting kids in, getting resources, cleaning up all of this. So as you're kind of thinking about our goal of like, what a challenge that these are some needs here. And specifically when we're looking to address the fourth grade teacher needs, we're not really working with a whole bunch of class time to support the teachers in these ways. So the next part of our story here is talking a little bit more about the district needs now that we see a little bit of this context here. And specifically in this district, they had 8 elementary schools, because our story today is going to start with 4th grade. And they were really wanting these elementary schools to have more similar data to connect these schools work together. Specifically in this district, they have a high transient student population. So they were looking just overall for ways to streamline programs across schools. So folks at the district level would be able to support those schools in a more streamlined and fluid manner. So at the district level, they wanted to pull all of those schools' data and information and be able to lead conversations with those teachers using data, being able to have really specific supports for those educators. And again, as a streamlining program lens. And then they also, this is, so fantastic. They had some what they called teacher growth days throughout the year to look at data. So here in this situation, there's a lot to celebrate. You see here in this gift that just even having that type of resource was fantastic because the stage was really set for this district to be able to have these common assessments because of this resource here of having that time to look at some data. So where they decided to start was from a very eager group of 4th grade educators. And through talking with some of those educators and talking with them about what would their assessment strategies throughout the year to be ready for the KSA at the end of the year, what would be most helpful for them, they decided that they wanted to start with what our topic is today, a pre-test. So they were really feeling that pressure at the beginning of the year. Not only did they only have 40-minute class periods, but also that 4th grade test covered more than just their 4th grade standards. So instead of dipping all the way down to like K or 1 or 2 grade, they're like, let's just look at the 3rd grade standards from last year, see how those went, and see what data we can gather about those 3rd grade standards that will help us with our 4th grade standards this year. So what they decided to do is they picked a handful of 3rd grade standards, just a couple to focus on. The teachers kind of had a menu of all of the standards, picked just a couple that just from their anecdotal experiences, they're like, I think these are, really big pieces, especially for our 4th grade standards this year to focus on. And to build this pre-assessment, they decided to pick 3 auto-scored questions per standard. So what that means is it was multiple choice or drag and drop, etc., where teachers were not scoring these items, but they wanted to pick rigorous questions for this assessment because it was technically the grade before's standards. So this is where Brendan's foundation setting is super important. They picked both 2-dimensional types of questions on inner orbit, so content and concepts type of questions, content and practices questions, and they picked 3-dimensional questions too, again, from those 3rd grade standards for this pre-assessment beginning of 4th grade. Then they thought, just so you can see the rest of the picture throughout the year, that it would be helpful if they had 2 more checkpoints throughout the year on their 4th grade standards. What was really cool is that, so they decided to do 2 benchmarks after their pre-assessment. So I believe like 1 at the end of the 1st semester and 1 maybe at the end of the 3rd quarter. And how they picked those 4th grade standards is they picked those standards according to the SCPs of the standards from 3rd grade. So I know that sounds a little complicated, but when they looked at the 3rd grade standards, they noticed, man, a bunch of these standards have modeling. Let's pick some 4th grade standards that have modeling too, so we can track how that progress of modeling develops from the beginning of the year with the 3rd grade standards and to our 4th grade standards the rest of the year. So it was just really neat. They had two different benchmarks the rest of the year, a mix of fourth grade standards for the benchmark one. And for benchmark two, they wanted to keep just the same fourth grade standards they had already assessed. They wanted to use some different phenomena just to see how students would respond to the same standards, but obviously in new contexts and scenarios. So just like this doggo here, they were really intentional with how they wanted to collect data at 3 different times of the year in a really low lift way, but a way to have some data points where they could look for growth between those 3 assessments. So what was very cool about this is these fourth grade teachers really led the way with this strategy. And as you all know, if you were teaching in a school district, word caught on. So some 7th grade teachers at a middle school in the district said, hey, 4th grade is doing this pre-assessment type of thing. And I believe at this point, the school year had already started. The 4th grade teachers already gave the assessment and they were so stoked about their data. The 7th grade teacher said, hey, even though we've already started the school year, can we also do a pre-test? So because at the middle school, they had a little bit longer of a class period, those 7th grade teachers picked 10 focus 6th grade standards, so from the grade prior. And they did that same pattern of picking 3 questions for each of those standards. And those were our rigorous questions, 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional questions, because they had seen what the 4th grade was doing. They really loved it. So they wanted to try it out too. So it was a little bit of a love story here in our conversation today. Any Taylor Swift fans out there, you can start singing. Okay. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to talk a little bit about, because we started with the 4th grade assessment story. From here, I want to talk a little bit about the 7th grade assessment and just give you a little bit of insight of what did this assessment actually look like, just as kind of a refresher to that foundation that Brendan set. So just to give you a little bit of understanding of the assessment content and design here, this is one of the 6th grade standards that the 7th grade team chose. So it's a middle school life science standard, and students are constructing an explanation that predicts patterns of interactions among organisms across multiple ecosystems. So that's a very wordy way to say that students are constructing explanations. That's our science and engineering practice. They're understanding about interdependent relationships in ecosystems as that ECI. And then that cross-cutting concept is patterns. Can you really see patterns and then use patterns to identify cause and effect relationships? So one of the phenomena that we chose for them for this standard on their assessment is one of my favorites on InterOrbit. It's obviously on the same standard, NSL 2.2, and it's talking about how did these tarantulas become frog friends is the phenomena that we're diving into. So we give students some information about the lesser black tarantula and the dotted humming frog. And we talk about that they have a very interesting relationship. Look at them, just like being buds there in that GIF, doing a little piggyback ride there. And we give some really interesting figures and information to really explain this relationship between these 2 species. So in figure 1, you'll see here that when the tarantula leaves its burrow, the dotted humming frogs make like a cheerleading formation there, blocking the burrow, which has tarantula eggs inside, but really blocking that burrow. We give kiddos some information here too about this food web. Some really interesting things to point out is the tarantula eggs, which ants think are a tasty, tasty snack, but the dotted humming frogs think those ants are tasty, tasty snacks. And then you can also see the relationship of the tarantula in this situation too, that the tarantula eats a lot of the predators of the dotted humming frog. So we give this information, and then also students look at a graph. So in the next slide here, we give students information about the population of both of these species in ecosystems where they coexist. So in the red line in both of these, we'll show ecosystems with the other species, and then the blue line shows populations of both of those species without each other. So, students can look at some patterns of data here to see about the benefits that both species have with each other. And then the questions they used on this pre-assessment, again, they used two 2D and then 1 3D question. So the content and practices question that they chose here says, refer to figure 2, which was the food web. In what ways does the lesser black tarantula benefit from having dotted humming frogs within the same ecosystem? So can you use qualitative evidence to construct an explanation? Perfect 2-dimensional question here with the SCP. And then they also picked a 2-dimensional question with the cross-cutting concept, which was patterns. So here was said, refer to figure 3. That was our graph quantitative data. Which of the following patterns can be identified over the course of a decade from the data provided. So students, can you look at the patterns in the data and be able to pull that finding out? And then finally, a three-dimensional question here, which says, thank you. What is a possible explanation for the pattern seen in the graphs of figure 3? So can you construct an explanation using the patterns to explain the relationships of these species within that ecosystem? So perfectly wonderful three-dimensional question. So we wanted to start with this story because when we look at this data coming up next, we really wanted to show you the rich situations and scenarios that kiddos were going through to produce three-dimensional data that these teachers used in their pre-assessment. So there's the story. The stage is set. This assessment was facilitated to students. What was the data that was produced and how can we analyze it? So passing it to Brendan for us to go through some of this awesome data and make some meaning from it.
Well, thank you very much, Erin, for setting the stage for us to go through a processing conversation around this data. So I think, understanding the assessment design and how we design questions is really important. And now understanding the end product of that and then what you can do with that is the second piece that we're going to go over today. So Erin has helped us to design a data chat protocol for teachers that maybe haven't had science data to look at before. And so that data chat protocol involves 4 different steps. And we're going to model the process of going through 3 of them. And then we're going to go through all 4 of them all together with y'all in the chat. So the first thing that we want to do is just observe our data. Just look at it. We don't want to solve problems yet. We don't want to do any analysis. We just want to see things. And after that, we can go into some analysis. We can make connections between ideas. And finally, we'll go into our implications. So what does this mean for what I need to do in my classroom? The problem solving portion, which is like the thing that I always want to jump at whenever we're doing this. And then we'll reflect upon that. And so that's a piece at the end to consider, like how we might change our assessment design next time or make alterations to the types of questions that we ask, or maybe even modifications to the assessment over time. Awesome. And so now we're going to dive into real data from this pre-assessment. And I do want to just, before I show, like this data, to talk about, this is a pre-assessment. So these students, in some cases, they had this content the year before, but there's no instruction that preceded this. They just went straight into this assessment. So these scores, like students struggled with this because it's a pre-assessment. We want to figure out where the work is needed. Okay, so this is the 4th grade data, the actual 4th grade data. And so here we're looking at the DCIs, the SEPs, and the cross-cutting concepts and trying to figure out where students were, had strengths and where they need more support from us. And so we've got the 3 different DCIs up at the top. There are 5 SEPs that were covered in this 4th grade assessment, and then 2 different cross-cutting concepts that were covered where, we can dig into the data. So I want you to just take a minute and take a look at this data. If you're like squinting at a tiny screen and you're like, I can't see that, Brendan, you got to be kidding me. Then I'm going to drop a link into the chat. You can click on that link to view the data in a more expanded form. And so click on the link in the chat or take a look at this data. Just take 1 minute to just notice, wonder before we go through our data protocol. Erin, should we get started? What do you think? Let's dive in. All right, put goggles on. So step 1 is going to be some observations. So what do you see when you look at this data? So feel free to write some observations in the chat, and that will often take the form of students excelled with blank or students struggled with blank. We ideally just want to discuss observations without judgment or interpretation, and we'll go through that process real quick out loud. So something that I see is that students did better, or they did well on motion and stability. So they got 50% of those questions correct. Erin, what's something that you see?
Yeah, that is the highest performing DCI in this 4th grade data. So in the science and engineering practices, and actually overall, the dimension they struggled with the most is, Nicole Satchel, I agree. Analyzing, interpreting data is where they struggle with the most. Another piece too, if you kind of just step back and look at all the 3 dimensions, so the cross-cutting concepts were actually scored the highest out of all the 3 dimensions, which is pretty cool looking in there. Yeah, anything, I have one more, but I don't want to steal it from you, Brendan, in case you're thinking of it too. So anything else you want to add of observations?
Yeah, so it also looked like obtaining, evaluating, communicating information was a little bit lower in terms of the, like the things that students may have struggled with more. I also see, it's difficult because the data isn't super dynamic, but there's a lot of good questions or a lot of good observations in the chat. Thank you all very, very, very much. much for contributing. It looks like the earth science scores were a little bit lower than the physical science scores, the DCIs. Is that what you're going to say? Okay, cool. Yeah, which is really interesting. Earth science sometimes can be like really, 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 really abstract for kiddos. And physical science is a little bit more concrete because they can observe it. It's not geologic time. Perfect. All right, let's move on to our second step, which is our analysis. And so in this part, what we're looking to do is think, what does the data suggest? Like maybe why, or what do I see? And so you can say students struggle with X because of Y, students understand A because of B. And ideally, what we want to do here is want to make sense of what the data says and why. Don't solve problems at this point. We're just like noticing, connecting things, but not trying to figure out what we're going to do about it. And so we can look at this data a little bit and talk a little bit more about that. And there are a couple of different elements in here that we can look at to see this data in greater detail. But let's look at this zoomed out view first. Erin, what does the data suggest to you?
So, and it's so hard, this protocol doesn't have to be like super lockstep, but I echo what you said at the last step about the earth and space science data being a little bit lower than the physical science, and some analysis to that is that, especially with this fourth grade data, it might be really abstract for them to visualize. So I'll start with that one. Would you like to add a piece of analysis on from here?
So I also see that, there were strengths in things like cause and effect and those physical science. So I'm assuming that there might be some cause and effect relationships that are involved in those physical science, especially motion and forces. So that's something that's kind of interesting to me. And yeah, I think also, so it is interesting that planning care investigations was so high, as was the cause and effect. And so students may have a higher than average ability to be able to draw conclusions, looking at causes and then looking at the effects of those things.
And from here, and we're kind of staying high level with this analysis because we wanted to show you high level data here to not drown in like too much data, which is a thing that can happen. But Brendan, if you want to click on both of those little elements on our inner orbit reports, you can drill down into each of these dimensions to see the specific elements of the standards that were assessed. Because as someone mentioned in the chat before, like analyzing, interpreting data is tough, but that's also a huge skill. So to see what was the actual element of the standard that was assessed for analyzing, interpreting data, and I'll read this aloud because I know it's tiny, is students were representing data in tables or other various graphical displays, bar graphs, pictographs, and or pie charts to reveal patterns that indicate relationships. And then for that second SEP, that was also a struggle for obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. That specific part of the standard that was assessed was obtain and combine information from books and or other reliable media to explain phenomena or solutions to design problems. So from an elementary perspective here, so for the obtaining, evaluating, communicating information, that element, that is like synthesizing information. And that is a huge reading comprehension strategy that is introduced from third grade to fifth grade and really built on. So at the fourth grade level, when you're asking students in a science way to obtain and combine information from books or other reliable resources, that is a large skill. So when you think about that in terms of development with ELA, like that's an interesting piece of analysis. And then even the other element there for analyzing, interpreting data, what that might suggest about that, I really lean into the graphical displays part of that element. Maybe students didn't see a wide variety of graphical displays. Like maybe we were just sticking with bar charts or bar graphs, and we didn't really dive into pie charts, or we didn't really show them maybe, and this would be an interesting piece for question analysis, what was the graphical display that was used for the question? And maybe it was one that, we hadn't had enough variety in our data. I wanted to add those in there too. Anything else you want to add on to that, Brendan?
No, I'm just reading things that people are writing in the chat. Brian's making the connection between analyzing and interpreting data and like maybe students are struggling with the idea of or understanding the difference between the analyzing and the interpreting. And then Lindsay mentioned that maybe students haven't had much explicit practice in analyzing data in third grade, and maybe that explicit practice will maybe start in fourth grade. And so that's super, super interesting. All right, let's move on to step 3 in our process here. So what are the implications? So a couple of things that we're going to look at here are saying things like we can extend students' learning by blank, or we can support students' growth by blank. This is an action-oriented step. We are now solving problems. We want to consider and clarify the step we want to take, who's going to do it, and when it's going to get done. And so this is like what I feel like we all lean into as educators. And so for me, it's clear to me that I would want to support students in analyzing, interpreting data. So I would want to look at the questions that students struggled with there, and I'd want to build specific scaffolds around like those types of data sets and figure out how I could support students with that data and building up their capacity around those data sets. Erin, what's something you might do with this data? What does this imply for you?
So overall, like one implication I might do from this data, especially with the two SEPs that were where students struggled the most, I'm actually not sure. I was like, man, I should have figured this out about this district. I can't remember if these teachers were specialists at the elementary level or generalists, but it might be super awesome to pull in your math compadres with analyzing, interpreting data, and then your ELA teachers as well, and share some of this data with them and really talk about like that connection of science really sitting at the precipice of math and ELA. It might be interesting to share, that data with them. To ask for extra support or extra resources. So I just saw a little bit of cross-pollination there. But I think, so since you said analyzing, interpreting data, for obtaining, evaluating, communicating information. So maybe, especially since that was about pulling information from multiple sources, having some sort of like graphic organizer or sentence stem where students can, write down, pieces of information as evidence or as, that information. And then having like a next piece with some sentence stems of like, in my own words, this means this, or in my own words, explaining something as a graphic organizer. Or even as someone said in the chat, that connection between analyzing and interpreting is super interesting. So there can even be a graphic organizer for that as well, where they record some observations of the data and then, they're scaffolded to making some interpretations. So I think from this data here, and this is what's so cool about this data is that there's no alarm bells, like massive alarm bells for the BCIs. And that's one of the hardest things to reteach when you're at the fourth grade level. Because you're like, I have barely enough time to teach my own content. Here, I think the big takeaway for the teachers is like we can lean into the practices as the place to move the needle. Like we might not need to totally scrap our fourth grade teaching and go back and reteach all third grade. No, let's lean into these SEPs with our fourth grade content. I think that's a really cool takeaway that they got from this is like, okay, we might not, there's room for improvement on the DCIs, but maybe where we can make the most bang for our buck core instruction wise is with the SEPs.
And maybe leaning into earth science a little bit more than you had intended if that wasn't something that you were in earth systems. So maybe looking at weather, looking at the movement of materials within those systems, those are definitely things that I would lean into as well. If I was going to do anything with the DCI information, that might be the thing that I would do. Okay, cool. So now what we want to do is transition into we're going to talk less and we're going to let y'all just have a fun chat party. And this is going to be using different data from this same district at the 7th grade level. And so if you want to see this data in expanded form, I'm going to drop yet another link in the chat. You can click on that to see what this data might look like in this context. So again, we're looking at the DCIs at the top, that's the content knowledge, the SEPs, kind of like the process skills of science. And then finally, the cross-cutting concepts at the bottom, which you can think about that as lenses that students are using to like view and analyze and make sense of phenomena. So I'm going to give you a minute to look at this data, and you can click on that link in the chat if you want to look at that a little bit more. But I'm going to click into the next slides that y'all can, in the chat, start making observations looking at this data. So this is different data than we just looked at. You can see that immediately with the number of DCIs that were covered in this assessment, which is substantial. And I'd love for y'all to dive into some observations in the chat. So what do you see? Students excelled with blank, students struggled with blank. We're only looking at observations without judgment or interpretation here. So go ahead and write some of those down in the chat.
Yes. So we just looked at the 4th grade data from the district, and this was the 7th grade data around the 6th grade standards in the same district. Yes, great question.
Loving all of these comments. Y'all are doing a great job. I just want to give props to folks for making observations and just showing what they see here, which is awesome. Let's move into our second stage in this, which is the analysis portion, where we're going to make connections between some of these ideas. I love that people even have up the fourth grade and the seventh grade data, and they're looking at the changes over time, which is that, I mean, that's obviously what we want folks to be doing at the district level. So just kudos to you for going the extra mile. And we didn't scaffold that for you, but you did it on your own. Okay. So I want you to think about this. What does the data suggest? So students struggle with X because of Y. And I want you to think about this in your context. So if you teach middle school or you support middle school educators, think about, like how developing user models might be connected to some of these standards. Maybe there are specific content areas where, models are used more often. Students understand A because of B. And then again, what we're looking to do is make sense of what the data says and why, but not solve problems here. So just think about what this data might say and why it might say that, and share your thoughts in the chat. Erin, anything jumping out in the chat?
It's amazing. Okay, I honestly don't have too much to add, to be honest, because it's fantastic. But a couple pieces I wanted to pull out. I thought it was fascinating because I didn't even notice this. And this is why doing data analysis with teams is so helpful, like PLCs, about the two SCPs, constructing explanations and designing solutions, and engaging in argument from evidence. Both of those are writing text-based like SCPs more so than the other two. So like that is super interesting, like connecting that. So maybe we're doing a good job, the district is doing a good job of having students write and craft, responses to text, but maybe they need to lean more into visualizing and modeling, and playing care investigation probably is a little bit of both. So I thought that was super interesting. A piece that I want to add too, I did add some element screenshots to this, Brendan, if you do want to uncover those, to kind of like throw in like bloop, another like little piece of data. I don't know, hope we're not banana peeling some of your thoughts here, but I wanted to show you some really interesting data points. So for the modeling SCP, there was two elements of this standard that were being assessed. So the first one is a little bit more generic, develop and use a model to predict or describe phenomena. But the second one is super interesting, develop a model to describe unobservable mechanisms. I saw someone in the chat talk about like the DCI relationships of like, in general, life science seems to be the highest DCI, which is kind of like in terms of like scale, might be like a more observable scale, but then physical science, more of a micro maybe scale, and then like ESS, maybe more of like a macro scale. Like both of those are unobservable. So anyway, I thought that's an interesting connection. And then the element for planning care and investigations is collect data to produce data to serve as basis for evidence to answer scientific questions. So it's data as evidence, which is interesting. If they're struggling with engaging in argument from evidence, maybe the part of the standard then is actually like collecting that data and understanding the data coming from investigations, so then they can use it as evidence, because it seems like the evidence part is going well. I don't know. My brain's exploding right now. Any other thoughts that you have too, Brendan?
I just think, so the constructing explanations and the engaging argument from evidence may be qualitative things where we're looking at like sentences and pulling information and citing this evidence. And this may be quantitative where we're looking at data sets. And so they also, that would make sense to me in that they did well with the more ELA focused skills of like, I see sentences, I can cite evidence, but I'm having trouble with numeric, like values and applying those.
That's amazing. We probably should boogie. I'm looking at the time. We're just like geeking out on this data. Y'all are doing great.
All right. Yeah, this is fantastic. And so let's boogie on to the data implications real quick. And so I want y'all to solve some problems here. So if these were your kiddos and you were trying to solve these problems, what would you do? How would you extend students' learning? How would you support students' growth? So I'm going to throw one out there to make sure that we have some ideas, which is that, so for developing using models, I would use some examples of flawed models and ask students, what would you change? I would have mostly complete models and allow students to use those things to kind of like incrementally change a model. I think that developing a model sometimes can be like a question where they start from nothing and we use that in some way. So that's just one thing that I would add in here, where I would use flawed models. I would ask them to like suggest a change or revision or evaluate models, but ways where they don't have to build things from the ground up. And maybe that can be a helpful way to scaffold up the process of developing models, and then also give them examples of ways to visually represent these interactions and systems.
I think that's great, Brendan, especially because that modeling SCP, and I don't have the numbers right in front of me, it is one of the most used SCPs in our standards. So they're going to see that over and over and over again. And I'm just so curious that if they can get those modeling skills down, that visualization, it might really help that content understanding, as we talked about before. So out of all of the pieces of analysis that we had, I think that's probably where I'd go to. The only other thing is a deep look at the earth and space science content. I know this is the sixth grade, standards for the seventh grade teachers. You might want to look at your life science pacing and if whatever standards for that, and kind of like either tighten it a little bit, or know you're good to go, but maybe give a little bit more space for the earth and space science standards if you get there.
Cool. Okay, cool. I want to make sure that we get to other parts of our presentation, but y'all have some awesome stuff popping up in the chat. And again, the idea is that we share our ideas and that we do this as a group and that we can all help each other. So thank you all so much for your thoughts and participation and everything you've written in the chat. Yeah, this is fascinating. Okay, cool. So I want to dive into the last part of this, which is our data reflection. And so I'm not going to go over this right now. We're just going to kind of talk about this and move on to the last part of our session, which is what might we do next. But when we reflect on data, we want to think about things like what questions about teaching and assessment did this data raise for you? Did questions of equity arise? How so? And if not, like, how do you know that you don't have questions about equity? What additional analysis would you like to complete and why? And then things like, what do you want to try in your classroom as a result of this data? These are some questions that we might use at the end of our data analysis. And with that, we're going to dive into the last part of our webinar, which is maybe going to take a couple minutes. I'm just going to be candid with y'all. But if you need a boogie at 30 after we are recording this, and we will send it out tomorrow. So Aaron, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk about, so what could we do next if this is our data and if you were advising us on this? What are some different lenses we can use to look at this?
Yeah, so we had, so many action items just from even looking at the data. So these are more kind of systemic ideas of outside of everything we just mentioned. Some other options of what you can do with pre-assessment data is option one here is you could have a multi-tiered systems of support, an NGSS response right off the beginning of the year to kickstart your support of students. So this was actual data from like a teacher's roster from these pre-assessments. And just from that data, you could go ahead and pull out the students in red, indicating they're going to be in a support group, the yellow group that they were going to be core, and that if the green group here, we can provide enrichment. So you can go ahead and hit the ground running at the beginning of the year with your tier systems of support, with your small group interventions, etc. So it's kind of a nice way to get going, because I feel like the beginning of the year always takes so long to like get going. So here you can have data you can just, start with to make those groups. The second, and we mentioned this a little bit as we were going, we also have reports at the district level about this data. So these are the two assessments, both the fourth grade and the seventh grade pre-assessment data. So you'll see a mix of elementary schools and also middle schools here. So here you can have a really interesting perspective if you are in the position of coach or support, that when you're looking at these SCPs, you can see the whole district results of the data at the top. I know that's really tiny data, but it's in that purple bar, and that's actually the data we just looked at. But then you can go by school to see, are there any outliers and either the excelling or the support, or just, rocking it as a core to really figure out where should I spend my time supporting teachers, because your time is valuable, teachers' time is valuable. And if you can be specific with what you want to support folks on, you can also differentiate for teachers as teachers can differentiate for their students. Okay, and this last piece is kind of a more option 3 for teachers and how you can kind of complete the assessment cycle with InterOrbit. So we did talk about, not having a whole lot of time to reteach that content. However, we do have those pre-made assessments, which we talked about before, and educators have access to grades 3 through high school assessments on InterOrbit. So if you were the fourth grade teacher, you could pick some of those third grade topics, quickly grab that formative third grade assessment that students struggled with that piece of content and use that as an instructional resource. Even though, it's an assessment, you can use it as a resource to have a whole class discussion or print those out to have some group work or make some stations using that formative assessment where kids will be able to go through a whole scaffold of questions. Then you could even give, so if you go through a couple of bullets on the screen, Brendan, you could also give the summative as pre-made assessment from that standard as kind of a reassessment, or after they had a little bit more time, here's like a second at bat of this third grade standard. So we have these pre-mid assessments, and you could dip down back to the grade bands, pick a different phenomena, use different questions, and use that as a reteaching tool. So back to you, Brendan, to officially wrap us up.
It's the holiday season, apparently, because there are Christmas decorations up around and other holiday decorations. And with that, we're going to wrap this up. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to go too far into that. So we can go back to those reports later on. Thank you all very much for being here and asking questions. So we went through a lot today and we did a lot of processing. I'm grateful for y'all's ideas and thoughts and questions as we went through it. Thanks for doing it. I still smell that potential, and I'm grateful for y'all grappling with everything that we talked about. So if you're interested in chatting with us and you want to start a pilot on your own, you are welcome to click on this link right here, and we'd be happy to work with you and chat with you and get you set up.
Thank you for being here. And actually,